What is a metaphor? A metaphor is stating that one thing is another thing. And we often see this as a unique little device we can use in our writing to make it more interesting. But I think the metaphor has a principle at work that can help us with every single facet of our writing. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. We as humans connect to stories. We love stories. And I go so far to say in another episode of this podcast that the basis of our thinking is actually a story. I almost constantly think about stories, and I constantly think about stories because I'm trying to get to the heart of what they are and why we connect to them. One aspect of storytelling that seems to fill my mind quite often is the idea of a metaphor. It seems to me that the idea of a metaphor is quite important in the storytelling and writing sphere, and I think it's far more important than we usually expect. So what is a metaphor? Well, as we understand it, a metaphor is saying something is something else. This is a literary device we use to show the audience something we are talking about. So for example, if I said he was a golden koi slipping through the water, I would not mean that the actual character was a koi, which is a fish, but that this character was doing something in some way, or he was in some way like that fish, that I can describe him in that way. Another metaphor is that the cat was a warm breeze blowing past my leg. Of course, the cat isn't a warm breeze, but the best way to describe a cat brushing my leg might be to say that it is one or that it feels like one. Another one that I've heard in the past is her lips were like the valleys and peaks of a mountain range on fire. Of course, a woman's lips aren't a mountain range and they aren't on fire, but this metaphor makes us think about the lips of that individual, makes us think about the redness, think about the color in a way we haven't before, and it likely makes us think of those lips from a specific angle. So yes, each of these are metaphors. Each of these are a literary device we use to describe something we're writing. We often think of metaphor as a tool we use and some small thing to add to our writing, as was done in these specific examples. But every time I think about metaphors and writing, the two seem much more connected. It does not seem that metaphors are just something that we put into stories. They seem like they may be more connected to stories, more like the sibling of a story rather than a child. One of the reasons why I think this is the case is because metaphors exist outside of writing and storytelling. I think metaphors exist in other forms of art as well. I think this is explicit, such as in paintings, but I think this can also be conveyed through such things as music. Vivaldi has an entire group of musical pieces that he names after the seasons, and these are supposed to mimic the seasons or in some way be the seasons for the person listening to them. So though it isn't necessarily a metaphor in the way we understand them to be in the literary world, it is in the place of a metaphor. It is taking on the same idea. It is trying to do the same thing. It is trying to take something that is different and put that in as a stand-in for the experience we're trying to convey, if that makes sense. So when I say that the cat was like the wind, the cat isn't like the wind, but I'm using the wind as a stand-in for the cat in that specific area. And in the same way, Vivaldi, in his Four Seasons pieces, uses different instruments and different motifs and different ways in which he constructs the music as a stand-in for those different seasons and different things within those different seasons. So I think to best understand that metaphor isn't a subordinate of storytelling, but rather a sibling or on the same level as storytelling, we need to look into how metaphors actually work. Metaphors work because we are taking two things and we are connecting them together. And our intention when we are connecting these two things together is to reveal something else about one of those two things. Now, you may say that similes do this as well, but I would ask you to offer up a simile that is as powerful as a metaphor. Now, I don't think that similes should not be used. I think that you can use similes. I think it's fine to use similes. I think that metaphors are generally much more powerful because the thing that is happening brings the two things you're talking about closer together. If I said the cat was like a breeze, it is much different than saying the cat is a breeze. I am closing the distance between two things and saying they are the exact same thing. And I think this is a shortcut for our brains. We don't have to think, oh, how would a cat be like a breeze? Instead of saying how a cat would be like a breeze, our mind jumps to a conclusion immediately because when we put the like in between two things, it is a signal to our brain that we have to figure out how they are similar. So that is why I think metaphors are more powerful, and I think that it's actually the case, though I would have to go into much more thinking to discover why this is, but I think it's actually the case that similes grow from metaphors and not the other way around. I think our minds naturally put things together in the metaphorical way rather than the way a simile works. Now, I've talked about again and again how when you are writing anything, in the end, you are trying to take something in your mind and put it on paper in a way so that that person who is going to read it can understand it in the same way that you put it on paper or how you understand it. So what we're trying to do when we write anything is try to make the reader understand it as we understand it. And we do this by taking the reader's knowledge and taking our own knowledge and conveying things to the reader using what we already know. So if I'm going to be talking about a trip to a far-off country and the reader has never been to that far-off country, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use specific things the reader already knows to explain what's in that far-off country. If you look at the documents or if you look at the travel logs of ancient travelers, you can find that ancient travelers talked about things differently from far-off countries because the world was more spread out. People didn't know about everything. When you described a giraffe to someone who lived in Scotland or Mongolia, you have to use things they already know. You could say, oh, it's an animal with a big long neck, but that doesn't convey everything because a giraffe is very similar to a cow. It also looks similar to a leopard. So you have to look around. You have to see what these people have in their lives. What are the things in their lives they're directly connected to? And then you can use those things to connect your ideas of whatever you're talking about to that person. As I stated before, we do this in our own thinking. And the fact that we do this in our own thinking is one of the reasons why I think metaphor is bigger than what we usually think. This is one of the reasons why I think metaphor goes beyond a mere literary device. When we think of something new, we always attach it to something we already know. And what happens in our minds is we start with that old thing. We start thinking about that new thing as it's attached to that old thing. And I think in most cases, we are thinking of that new thing as that old thing. And slowly we are able to form our ideas about that new thing, or we experience it more and it eventually becomes its own separate entity in our mind. This has always happened to me when I meet new people. When I meet new people, most of them get attached to someone I already know. I think, oh, this person is like this person I knew from my past. This person is like this old teacher. This person is like this old friend. And at first I view this person through the lens of the person I've already met. But eventually the person grows in my mind. The idea of them grows in my mind, and eventually I see them as their own individual person. This is really easy to see when you see siblings. If you know one person from a family and you finally meet the rest of their family, it is going to take some time before you stop seeing that first person in every single other family member. And eventually it is the case that these people do take on their separate ideas in your head. But just because this happens in our thinking, it doesn't mean that metaphors are bigger than what they are understood to be in literature. What I would suggest you do to actually see this in action, to actually see that metaphors are extremely powerful, and one of the reasons why I think metaphors go beyond just a literary device is because they are so powerful in our writing and our thinking. But one of the ways you can see that they are so powerful, and one of the things I think show is that they are beyond just a literary device, is if you start to see your storytelling and your thinking through metaphors, especially your storytelling. So if you approach a story and you think that you are going to be conveying your story in metaphors, that is going to be changing how you think about your story. Now, when I say that you are conveying your story in metaphors, I don't necessarily mean that every other line of your story is going to be conveyed in a metaphor. But what I do mean is that you are thinking of different things that parallel one another. If you are writing a single paragraph and you are trying to convey a castle, if you're trying to explain a castle to a person, first you need to take ideas that you already know, unless you've actually been in a castle. If you have never been in a castle, you need to take ideas you already know to explain that thing. But you also need to take into account your audience. If your audience has never experienced what it's like to be in a castle, or your audience has never experienced the things you're explaining, you're going to have to take one step more back to a point that they know. You're going to actually have to find out what they know so that you can write in a way that they'll actually understand what you're talking about. And that's kind of what I mean by looking at things through a metaphor. You're looking at things through connections rather than this linear plot line you're trying to tell. Instead of thinking of your story as a linear plot line when you're trying to figure out what it's about, think of how everything connects to everything else, and then think about how that story is going to interlock with your audience and the world in general. The goal of thinking this way is to not to make a weird, abstract story, but to seek out that connection between different things. And I think that if you seek out that connection between every little detail in your story, as well as your story as a whole, you're going to have a story that comes to life much more easily for other people. This goes back to the idea that everything should be written to convey what you are trying to convey. So that is the ultimate goal of looking through metaphors, because I believe they have so much power to allow us to actually take the ideas in our mind and place them in another's mind through writing. If you enjoyed this, you're probably wondering how you can support me. Well, you can actually do two simple things. Follow the first link below to grab a copy of my book, and then follow the second link and sign up for my newsletter. It's that simple. Those two things will mean the world to me and give me more time to write books and create content for you. As always, my name is Daniel Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.